this presentation, welcome to Idenlea. Oh, there we go. Because I'm zooming in from my house, which is on the former grounds of a place once called Idenlea, which was developed into my neighborhood 100 years ago. I know your time is valuable, so I want to thank you for making time in your evening to hear about this story. I am overwhelmed by the response to this presentation. I think it speaks to an interest in digging deeper into local history to find the forgotten or kind of untold stories that have shaped our lives today in ways both big and small. Since this is a presentation hosted by the Bala Cynwyd Library, my hope is that you see this as an invitation to a community historical research project to learn with me about the significance of these amazing women pictured here in our shared history here in Bala Cynwyd, more broadly in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and on a national scale, given the work that they did. A warning, I have a lot of ground to cover, and there's a lot of information on my slides where I want to show you the evidence that I have assembled through this project. I've tried to make the presentation engaging with some interactive elements, and to give us time, as we discussed, for Q&A at the end. I'll move quickly, so if you miss something, the recording will be there for you to circle back afterwards. So please use the chat. I find that one indicator of a thought-provoking presentation is a lively chat. So we can loop back to those questions and comments at the end. And for those of you watching this as a recording, I have my email on the last slide, so you can feel free to send me your feedback and your questions that way. So I'll begin tonight by introducing myself and give you some framing for what has become a sprawling historical research project. I'll spend about an hour sharing the most compelling parts of my research to date about this place, once called Idenlea, and the family who called it home. And then at the end, I'd like to figure out with those of you who might want to get more involved in this project, kind of where it may go. And so I want to ask those of you with connections to this area, does what I share spark any recognition in you of a story you heard decades ago? You know, is there any living memory of these people here? Is there someone you think should be looped in because they have expertise or insights on this kind of story? This is not a report on a finished product. This is a desire for me to share findings as they're coming in, including some as recently as a few days ago, and then attempt to build something together with this community. So I hope you'll stick with me until the end because there's good stuff kind of all the way through, including some materials and archives that have been collecting dust for quite a while. And some of my final slides have some twists that are worthy of a Netflix special, in my opinion. So first, I'd like to introduce myself to answer your questions about why me, why now? I've always been interested in the natural world and science, and I was trained as a biologist and a conservation biologist. And so I've been so fortunate to spend the last 15 years or so with the American Museum of Natural History in their Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, which has been my mostly remote work. So what does a conservation biologist do? Well, in my case, that includes field research on salmon and sea turtles. I've been fortunate to research and help curate exhibitions on topics of food and water. I develop educational materials for conservation and teach at Columbia University. And these two key things that I think have pulled me so strongly into this research. So thinking about what it means for people to be connected to the places where they live, and researching and sharing stories of people who have been underrepresented in the sciences through a project called Untold Stories, organized by the Women in Natural Sciences chapter at the American Museum of Natural History. And I'll mention this because while the work I'll share tonight is kind of outside the scope of my work at the museum, it is very much informed by the lessons I have learned along the way from tremendous mentors. And I've always been interested in history and genealogy and looking at old family pictures and asking for the stories behind them, but I am not a historian, but research is very much my thing. And asking questions about the world and building collaborations to try to answer those questions. And so I am collaborating with several historians on this project, and some of them are on this Zoom, and they have confirmed that this is a story worth telling, and it hasn't been told before, because historians who know about the people I will talk about were not aware of a connection of this family with Bala Cynwyd, and knowledge about the presence of these people here in Bala Cynwyd wasn't on the local radar either. And so I welcome kind of different interpretations or even corrections on the evidence I will present tonight, because through this project, I am learning as I go. So how does one piece together an untold story like this? And I realize this is a lot of words. So what I'm trying to do on this slide is give you a sense for what this has looked like for me. So it's been everything from visiting cemeteries, searching from headstones, visiting historical archives, interviewing people in Lower Marion and Philadelphia, tracing deeds for my house and my neighbors' houses, some going back to the 1880s. And I am so grateful for the folks who have collaborated with me on this project listed here. So in Lower Marion, in Philadelphia, and beyond. So how did this all start? It started with a question about the almost 100-year-old house where my family lives now in Bala Cynwyd, shown here. As mentioned in the introduction, my family and I moved to Cynwyd Road in 2015 by way of Boston and New York and DC when I was pregnant with our youngest child. And as you can imagine, the past several years have been consumed by the challenges of raising children as a working parent, and then a pandemic. But I always had the urge to research the history of the first house we ever owned. So who has lived here? What are their stories? You know, what was here before this house? And so on kind of a random day, almost exactly 6 months ago, right before Thanksgiving, I thought now's the time to start. And so I reached out to a neighbor to ask where to start, and she directed me to the Lower Marion Historical Society website, where I found a treasure trove of atlases going back to 1871 and maps going farther back than that. And what I found were names on some very old atlases that showed who owned the land where I now live. And these names are very historically significant because I quickly moved from thinking, cool, 2 of these women have Wikipedia pages, to thinking, whoa, there is so much that is not on these Wikipedia pages. And for reasons I don't even quite understand yet, the project has grabbed a hold of me so tightly that sometimes there are literally not enough hours in the day. So if you told me back then I would be giving a Zoom presentation to all of you about an old house and people who lived over a century ago, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But here I am, and here you are. And so why should you care about the story of Idenlea? And to try to answer that, I go back to 6 months ago when I had never heard of any of the names I will share with you today. But for someone who works on a project called Untold Stories, I have found one of the most fascinating untold stories I've ever come across, quite literally in my backyard. And so I am piecing things together because no amount of Googling will get you this story. And there are gaps in what I'm piecing together. And so I welcome your interpretations of what I've found so far. Every time I find an answer to a question I have, it generates more questions. But I have come to know that the people connected to Idenlea, the names that are here, are historically significant, and they shape the world that we now live in. They dedicated their lives to causes of tremendous significance: the anti-slavery movement, abolition, women's rights and suffrage, and a citywide fight against entrenched political corruption. Idenlea is the last existing physical trace of a gathering place for some remarkable and inspiring people. And the knowledge of these celebrities in Lower Marion seems to have been forgotten, except for one man who I will get to later in the talk. And even the impact of some of these people in Philadelphia has been lost to time. All the other homes they lived in have been demolished. Their actual physical remains have been unknown for every major figure I will talk about today, and have not been public knowledge for about 100 years. And I will explain what I mean by that later in the talk. But it seems to me that these stories about these people in this place were lost to history, and I feel that they're stories that should be told and should be shared widely. Before we get into the stories, I want to touch on where all this is going. So in about 2 weeks, I will hit the submit button on a nomination for the Women of Idenlea for a Pennsylvania Historical Marker. And in the rest of this presentation, I will explain why I feel they merit this recognition. And I'd love to share this research more widely by publishing the findings, maybe other ways. I have heard some amazing stories of people in my neighborhood after it was subdivided, and I don't have time to share them today, but as I have learned, even significant stories can be forgotten over time. And so is there interest in a community shared history? What might that look like? Use the chat to share what you think about the idea of sharing kind of a shared history about a neighborhood. So without further ado, let's get into the stories. So where is Idenlea? It's in Bala Cynwyd, the closest suburb to Philadelphia. The border with West Philadelphia is less than a half a mile from my house. Here I'm showing you a map of Idenlea in relation to Philadelphia. And this is an atlas made by my friend Jim Bevlock of an estate that was subdivided and developed between 1921 and 1925 into my neighborhood. So the top is an atlas from 1920, the middle is from 1926, and the bottom shows you what was where. The red arrows here are showing you Idenlea's house on the map, and then where it shows up in a 1926 aerial photograph of the same area. And you can see my house below it. So I can look up the hill and see the house of Idenlea from my porch. And these houses are still here. But the trees along Heather Road, they're much bigger. And you can see this house here on the atlas, how there was a long kind of teardrop shaped driveway that went past the house, and it went back to a series of stables and barns that were once behind the house. You can see this pond that's next to Bala Avenue. This was filled in 1921 and paved over when Cynwyd Road was built. For those of you familiar with the area, at the top we have North Highland Avenue. We have Bryn Mawr Ave to the left. On the right is Bala Ave that's passing through the Bala downtown. This sharp corner up here is where the Italian restaurant Pescatore now is. And across Bala Ave is the historic Bala Theater, built in 1926, and you can actually see it under construction in this aerial photograph. So the house on that atlas is still here. It's an 1896 stone Queen Anne with stunning curved arches around its entrance. It's set back from the road behind trees, so it's really easy to walk or drive by it and pay it no attention at all. But when you stand in front of this house, you can see why Highland Ave has its name, especially in the winter when the leaves are off the trees. It's the highest point around, and you can see clear to downtown Philadelphia. This house is overflowing with significant history. In the 1950s, it was converted to apartments and has had several ownership changes since. And so the history of the house and who built it has been forgotten over time. And it's significant because the people who built this place did amazing things with their lives, things that matter to our lives right now. And so returning to the names on the atlases, because before I get more into the place, I want to focus on the who, because I think this is where the power of the story comes through. Why am I so excited about the names on these atlases? Dr. Jane Viola Myers, Dr. Hannah E. Longshore, and Lucretia Blankenberg. So let's start with the last one. Lucretia Mott Longshore Blankenberg, and probably very few of you on this call know her name, but 100 years ago, everyone knew who she was because she was known in her later years as the grand old lady of Philadelphia for her decades of work in the cause of women's rights and suffrage, and also civic reform. So she was a celebrity for all the right reasons. As an example of her status in the city of Philadelphia, when she turned 80, the who's who of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania threw a party for her that had about 1,400 attendees from 100 different women's clubs and civic clubs in the city. And then a decade later, when she turned 90, there were 3,000 people at her birthday party, which is amazing to contemplate. So in a story with a lot of people involved, I will start with her and I will focus on her because it's her voice that comes through the most. She wrote an autobiography that has been a key primary research source for this project. It's called The Blankenburgs of Philadelphia. And there are copies of it at the Bala Cynwyd Library. Excellent resource. She made key choices that affected the legacy of her family and the development of Cynwyd Road. And because she lived in that house I showed you just under 100 years ago. So this woman was not only an unparalleled leader for social reform, but she was also super interesting. And she was one tough lady. She came of age during the Civil War. She saw tremendous change in the country throughout her lifetime. She traveled extensively and she spoke publicly with like a legendary confidence. She lived a full 92 years and received many prestigious awards, was a fixture in the newspapers. I mentioned her birthday party. For that occasion, her closest friends made a commemorative volume. And I went to see this at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and there are 100 pages of heartfelt letters from the who's who in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and civic society, speaking so highly of her accomplishments. And so notable friends sharing deeply personal notes about what their friendship to her, meant to them and reflecting on their shared struggles together. One of those friends was the well-known artist Viola Oakley, who painted this portrait of Lucretia that hangs to this day at the Drexel University College of Medicine campus. And Lucretia wrote this book when she was 83, so it covered her long life. She has a very dry wit that's very endearing. So for example, in a newspaper article, she described herself as aggressive, but not to the point that she ever set fire to anything, which I thought was delightful. She also had a soft side. So I found this touching photograph of her in some archives towards the end of her long life, holding this adorable baby during a fundraising campaign for a new maternity hospital. She was sharp and active through her entire 92 years. She gave a speech just a few days before her death from pneumonia. Later in the talk, I will share some more mysteries of Lucretia, including one that seems to have stumped every single person I have talked to about it. But she was not just a celebrity because of her inspiring career, but also because of the family she was born into, a family of Hicksite Quaker activists who were radical for their time. A key figure in this family is Lucretia's mother, Dr. Hannah E. Longshore. She was a member of the first graduating class of women physicians in Philadelphia and in the country. She was the first practicing woman physician in Philadelphia. She was the first woman ever to teach at a US medical school. And at the end of her 40-year career in medicine, she had one of the largest practices in this city, regardless of gender. Dr. Longshore was also massively interesting. And so here are a few tidbits about her. Her husband's writings show that she used to drive her own team of horses at a breakneck pace around the city doing her house calls, to the point that another big name physician, Dr. Ann Preston, thought this was unladylike. But her daughter, Lucretia, later said that the strength in her arms from driving horses is what helped her birthing children. When she opened her practice, there was tremendous opposition that I will talk about later. And she built a reputation in several ways, one of which was by healing a prominent woman whose case had been determined to be hopeless by the male physicians of the city. And the family Lucretia was born into also had another pioneering physician, Dr. Jane Viola Myers, her aunt, one of the first women to graduate with an MD. She was also one of the first women members of the faculty at a US medical school. She had a 35-year practice. She did not have the celebrity of her older sister, but her practice was equally extensive. And both of them were caring for the women and children of Philadelphia, regardless of race, regardless of class or ability to pay. And so I'll go more into the detail of their accomplishments a bit later in the presentation, but I wanted to highlight that these two sisters bought Idenlea for their retirements from a combined 75 years of medical practice in Philadelphia. The years that they studied and practiced medicine occurred during a time when women couldn't vote. They had few legal or property rights. They had essentially no opportunities for higher education and no opportunities to pursue occupations beyond housework and sewing and nursing or keeping a store or boarding house. They both died before the fullest outcomes of their work came to be, because despite living in and contributing to a country known for its democratic system of government, they never cast a vote in an election because they both passed away before the great fight to secure women's voting rights resulted in the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. As you can see from the asterisks here, these three women are on the deeds of Idenlea through time, at a time when it was infrequent for women to own property. And these documents indicate the success of the sisters. So every document says MD after it or doctor before it, giving us a sense for the status and kind of esteem of these women. And remember, Idenlea was a place for them to retire after full lives. So a lot of their significant work happens before Idenlea is built, but not all of it, because they were incredibly active during their later years, all of them working until the end of their lives. Lucretia Blankenberg was also famous because of who she was married to, the great reform mayor of Philadelphia, Rudolph Blankenburg, the only independent mayor in the history of the city. He was with the Keystone Party, so he was not a Democrat or Republican. He fought entrenched corruption in Philadelphia for decades, and he was known as the old war horse of reform. And I included in here photos of him in his youth and his older years when he was the mayor. And 10 years after he passed away, Lucretia wrote his biography in that book I showed you earlier. So I will spend a good chunk of my time on Lucretia Blankenberg and her mother and her aunt and her husband and their relationship to Idenlea. But there are lots of other fascinating characters in this family I want to mention quickly. So let's build this around Lucretia again. Incredibly, her family included two more trailblazing women physicians, and for each of these people have fascinating stories. I can quickly touch on them. Dr. Mary Frayne Thomas was a half-sister of the women doctors of Idenlea. She was the first practicing physician west of the Alleghenies. She was a suffragist, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, one of the few women physicians who served in the Civil War. Her daughter Julia became the fourth president of Wellesley College. Another aunt on the other side of the family was Dr. Anna Longshore Potts, another very early woman physician who thought sharing medical knowledge with the public could lead to the prevention of disease. And so she made her career traveling around the US and the world, giving public health lectures. So a true kind of global celebrity. And she also wrote books on women's health and physiology. And she was also an inventor who patented a medical device for women in 1896. Her uncle, Dr. Joseph S. Longshore, the man who co-founded the schools where these women studied. He was a committed ally for women in medicine. When he co-founded the school, this was considered so radical that he lost most of his patients, and due to his abolitionist views, he lost many more. He played a pivotal role in recruiting Dr. Longshore into medicine because she trained with him before she began her studies. And Lucretia's father, school teacher, writer, and ardent abolitionist, Thomas E. Longshore, a man who wrote extensively about his wife, giving us kind of a deeper window into her story. And so I just showed you 8 people in this extended family who led full, inspiring lives. And I really struggled with how to convey their significance. And because this is how my brain works, I made a table. And so this family had leadership roles in all of these organizations. And more, I didn't even have room to include. So anti-slavery and abolition, women's rights and suffrage, women in medicine, civic reform and good governance, and the peace movement. If this is material that's of interest to you, this is a time when you might want to screenshot. For many of these things, I'm learning as I go because my education didn't cover a lot of this. And through this learning, I'm thinking about how these actions 150 years ago affect my life today. I'll trace just one of these lines on women in medicine. So this family played a key role in founding the schools that educated women. They gave public health lectures on medical subjects at a time when these things were just not discussed. And they were 2 of the first women to teach at a US medical school. But this is only the tip of the iceberg of their impact. And what I'm trying to show here is that they use the power of organizing and trying to move this country towards a more inclusive democracy and the power of moral principle to make tremendous change at many scales. To give you a sense for the social circles these people moved in over a long time span, I have a guessing game. I hope the chat will fire up. These are some of the people in their social circles. I've given you their images and their initials. What are your guesses on who are the people in these photos?
Susan B. Anthony, Amelia Earhart,
Sojourner Truth,
Lucretia Mott, and Sojourner Truth.
and Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
You got it. Well done. That's great. So yes, incredibly, Sojourner Truth and Lucretia Coffin Mott, renowned in their time, abolitionists, women's rights activists. Dr. Hannah Longshore named her only daughter after her good friend, Lucretia Mott. Sojourner Truth was a house guest of this family when she visited Philadelphia to speak at gatherings. Frederick Douglass, legendary social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, statesman, he attended these same gatherings. Suffragist Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, friends of the family over decades. Susan B. Anthony gave Lucretia Blankenberg lessons in public speaking. And aviator Amelia Earhart, who spoke at a 1930 luncheon in honor of Lucretia Blankenberg that was attended by 2,000 people. You might be sensing a theme here on how these women attracted a crowd. So I hope I've convinced you that this is a family worth knowing about. For the next section of the presentation, I will take you through a history of people, place, and time in relation to Idenlea. But before I do, I want to say that the land was inhabited, this land was inhabited after the last ice age by the ancestors of the Lenape people. And I want to say that women have been doing medicine and healing people since the very beginning on this land. And despite the past 300 plus years since it was settled by people from Europe, that healing knowledge and wisdom has persisted. And so in the work that I do at the museum, it's common to start with a land acknowledgement, especially when you're talking about a particular place. You'll hear land acknowledgements most commonly in places like Canada and Australia, which have had truth and reconciliation commissions looking at the history of the land and its people. And you'll start to hear more of this in the US as well. Some of you, I suspect, might have never heard one. When done carefully, a land acknowledgement can be a powerful way of showing respect for and honoring the Indigenous people of the land on which we live and work. And so I want to start this section on people, place, and time by acknowledging the Lenape people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we are now located, and recognize the long-standing significance of these lands for Indigenous nations and peoples past, present, and future. So with the arrival of settlers, many Lenape people were involuntarily displaced from their lands to Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario. With this slide, I wanted to help guide you kind of through the next several slides. So at the bottom, we will see kind of a timeline. In the middle, you'll see in yellow groups of people kind of moving through time. And the top is the evolution of the name of this place. And the rest of the talk, you'll see a lot of maps and documents, but I wanted to say that the Lenape people didn't use maps or deeds. They used their language and their names and their place names and their stories and their connection with the land to build meaning about the world and pass that down through countless generations. So the ancestors of the women of Idenlea moved around a bit. They eventually settled in Bucks County in 1840s. And the family survived by farming, and it was a really hard life for Hannah and her siblings. Many biographies describe kind of the harsh conditions of the family's early years. But their father, abolitionist Samuel Myers, was determined to educate his children. And you can see the results based on their trailblazing success. In her autobiography, Hannah Longshore talks about her childhood fascination with the natural world and how she wanted to study at Oberlin College, which started admitting women in 1837, but her family did not have the money to support this dream. In 1850, the Female Medical College, co-founded by Dr. Joseph Longshore, opened in Philadelphia and drew this family to the city. And so Dr. Longshore apprenticed with him and prepared for her schooling by studying history, astronomy, philosophy, chemistry, botany, anatomy, and physiology. In the 1880s, the sisters purchased a plot of land in Bala Cynwyd for their retirement, and this passed after their deaths to Lucretia Longshore Blankenberg. And the rest is history. So after 1921, there were 100 years of development in this Philadelphia suburb. So let's trace the earliest known history of this place that became Idenlea by looking at some maps and documents. This is a 1687 map that shows property settled by Edward Jones and Company, Quakers from Wales. And the red boxes show you the area that became Idenlea for reference. Fast forward 60 years to see construction of some of the earliest roads in areas that had only almost been completely deforested and converted to architecture or agriculture or mills. And these were roads that followed the paths of the indigenous people of this land. So navigating the topography of hills and waterways. Let's fast forward another 100 years. In 1851, this map on the right shows the property of Jacob Stadelman. And you can see the shading on the hill to indicate an incline coming down from what's now Highland Avenue. So you can clearly see why water was draining into the pond that flowed south to City Ave. So while this was happening outside of Philadelphia, what was this family up to in the city? Dr. Hannah Longshore and her sister-in-law were the first women to receive their medical degrees in Philadelphia. And a few years later, the other two sisters received their degrees. And then Dr. Longshore and Dr. Myers took turns on the faculty as demonstrator of anatomy. Let's talk about Dr. Longshore a bit more. So I included this lovely photograph of the doctor about when she graduated, arm in arm with her daughter, Lucretia, at an age of around 6 years old. And the story of that graduation is quite dramatic because there were many threats to disrupt it, because the idea of training women in medicine at this time was radical and unwelcome for many. So the mayor sent police to protect this graduation of 8 graduates due to the threats to disrupt it. And Lucretia talks in her book about her 6-year-old self, so proud to see her mother up there on the stage, but also terrified about her safety. And she was open about how hard it was to be the child of a woman physician, the taunting and cruelty of other people. And that shaped her views about the need to fight for women's rights. And so here I have a list of the faculty at the Female Medical College with Dr. Longshore's name and the ad that she placed in the newspaper when she opened her practice. We have good insights into Dr. Longshore because there are archives from her and her family. One of them is a handwritten autobiography that starts, "The women physicians in Philadelphia did not find their paths strewed with flowers, nor their advent welcomed by the general public or the profession." And she shares how she became interested in reform politics and activism, how she wanted higher education, but it was impossible, challenges of her practice, and the need for firm support from her husband and her family. In her autobiography, she describes a vivid confrontation with a pharmacist. They wanted to read it because it gives you a sense for what the obstacles were. I went to one of the leading pharmacists to purchase some ounces of drugs, placing my business card on the counter. The proprietor looked at it and then at me and said, "I will not sell these drugs to you. You are out of your sphere. Go home and darn your husband's stockings. Housekeeping is the business for women." I informed him that my house was probably as well kept as his and that the stockings were darned. As a graduate of the Female Medical College, chartered by the legislature of Pennsylvania, I proposed to practice medicine as long as the women of Philadelphia saw fit to employ me and I had the strength to work, which is really powerful stuff. In this autobiography, she also talks about her strategy to build her practice through a series of innovative public lectures that she co-organized with the legendary Lucretia Mott, who was an early supporter of women in medicine. So women were thirsting for knowledge about their own bodies in an age when these things were not discussed. In writing, her husband said 1,000 people attended her first lecture at Musical Fund Hall in Philadelphia. And as far as I can tell, these lectures were the first time a woman physician shared information taught as part of a medical curriculum with the public in Philadelphia. So she brilliantly used these lectures to launch her career and build her practice despite tremendous public opposition to women doctors, because the women who attended these lectures then sought her out for care. So all the documents I just showed you are at the Drexel Legacy Center Archives and Special Collections at Drexel University. Guess what else is there? Artifacts from this family. In the collection are Dr. Longshore's monograms letterbox, one of the medical journals that she read, her medicine kit, a combined dilator and uterine syringe that she used in her extensive obstetrics practice, and incredibly, a scrap of fabric from the wedding dress of her mother, Paulina Iden, who is the namesake of Idenlea, and she was the granddaughter of Quaker Randall Iden Jr., born at the end of the 17th century in England, settled in Bucks County. The Iden family has a genealogy that traces back to the 1200s in Europe. What else? Here's a peek at the volume of the collections on this family in the middle. And there's documents from their suffrage work. So this is a program from the 1900 meeting of the National American Women's Suffrage Association with notes inside. There's also a scrapbook on the history of the Women's Medical College, written by her father, that Lucretia inscribed while she was living at Idenlea in Kenwood, Pennsylvania. So the hints were there all along. And so the sisters came to have their medical practice together at a few places in the city. What else was happening? Lucretia Blankenberg got married to Rudolph Blankenberg. They had 3 daughters together. There's a contemporaneous biography of Dr. Longshore written in the 1870s that talks about this vibrant multi-generational household of grandparents and aunts, and parents and children, and just a really dynamic and exciting kind of time in their lives. I also wanted to share this obituary of Dr. Joseph Longshore, who died around this time, because his work was so essential to creating space for women to expand their sphere. And it says, to educate women in medicine was the leading desire of the last 30 years of his life. By his voice and pen, in private and public, he advocated and defended it amid great opposition, which drives home the role of the men in this family, creating space for women to pursue their dreams in a world where that space just did not exist. What else was happening during these years of medical practice? I mentioned before this vibrant household that then experienced unimaginable loss. So the family lost their 5-month-old daughter, Emma. Here's her death certificate, noting her cause of death was cholera infantum, which is an endemic infection that occurred in the summer, and she passed away in July. And she was buried at the Fair Hill Burial Ground, which is a Quaker burial ground, one of the first racially integrated cemeteries in Philadelphia. And then her sister, Marion Blankenberg, 9 years old, died from diphtheria and was buried with her sister at Fair Hill Burial Ground. And maybe you can tell from this empty space what is coming next. The Blankenbergs lost their 13-year-old daughter, Julia Blankenberg, to the same bacterial infection that killed her sister. And the red boxes here are call outs to who signed their death certificates. So Emma's was signed by her great aunt, Dr. Myers, and Marion and Julia by their own grandmother. Both of these physicians most certainly tried everything to treat these infections in an age before vaccines and before antibiotics. And I point out here that all of them were buried at the same burial ground, which is a detail that will become important later in the talk. In her book, Lucretia Blankenberg describes the daughters as the joy of their home. And she created funds in the name of Marion and Julia Blankenberg with the Children's Aid Society of Philadelphia. So in her will, she said the bequest was in memory of 2 of the loveliest children who ever blessed a home. A few weeks ago in the Drexel archives, I found this photograph of Julia Blankenberg tenderly holding the hand of her father at their farm in Jersey that had been in the family since around the time of the Civil War. They sold this farm after the loss of their final daughter. Bear Hill Cemetery, North Philadelphia. I'll talk about it a little bit later. Thank you. And so the future of this family ended here. And I think part of the reason why Idenlea was forgotten is because these girls did not survive to tell the stories of their family and continue the legacy of their remarkable great-grandparents and grandparents and parents. I have done a partial genealogy on this family. I'm struggling to find any living relations. And I think this is partly why I feel like I want to share their stories. What did the Blankenbergs do after all this loss? In her book, Lucretia explains, they resolved to do all they could to help others, as simple and timeless and powerful as that. And so after Julia died, it was another 20 years before Blankenberg became the mayor. And it was during that time that they committed themselves to making life better for other people and shaped the city that we know today. So let's take a deep breath because that was a lot. I will too. So while all this was happening in Philadelphia, what was happening in the land that became Idenlea? So in 1886, as she was nearing retirement, Dr. Myers spent the equivalent of $330,000 in current money for a plot of land, a beautiful spot high on a hill with a view of the city on Highland Avenue. It had a pond at the bottom of the property and nothing else around. And this is the deed from that purchase. I have wondered how Dr. Myers came to choose this beautiful place. And interestingly, she bought the property from Samuel Stadelman, who opened the first pharmacy on the main line in 1868. Could that be how their paths crossed? Maybe. The next year, Dr. Myers sells parts of her property to her sister, Dr. Longshore, for $5,000. Here's the deed for that sale. So they co-owned Idenlea together. And this atlas shows what else was there. Not much. So we have Kinwood Station. We have a few homes along Union Ave, but pretty much not much happening around this area at this time. At some point, she built an L-shaped house with a stable and a barn below it. And this clip from a newspaper describes the attractive stone house that she built on one of the highest spots around. So this was the country estate for retirement for this family. And they had really busy lives in retirement, but they also had time for fun. They went on a cruise to Europe together in 1895. About a year later, Dr. Myers ended her medical practice, was still working on various social reform causes, became a botanist. She replaced the first house with a bigger one. And this is the first time you'll see Idenlea on an atlas. And the first time Dr. Longshore is shown on an atlas, though she was on the deeds going back to 1887. I am working on identifying the architect of this house, but it has been tricky so far. I see wealth as one possible indicator of the success of their medical practice. Their parents were teachers. There was no family wealth whatsoever when they began their careers. They were devout Quakers. They practiced a simple life. They sewed their own clothes. Their main expenses were to purchase homes and horses to support the practice. But in almost every obituary I found of Dr. Longshore when she died in 1901, it says she was sharp and active until her death, and she retired with a small fortune. And this wealth was earned, and I sense it was a reflection of her skill. I'm interested in following this earned wealth. So a few years after Dr. Longshore's death, the Blankenbergs sold their houses on Arch Street for what is the equivalent of $3 million, to give you a sense for the success of this simple family. And in a few minutes, I will share with you a part of the legacy of this small fortune. Before I do, I want to take a side trip with what was going on at this time in the turn of the century. So I've talked a lot about the well-known names associated with Idenlea, but I'm also very interested in the stories of the people behind the scenes, the servants in these places, immigrants from Ireland, immigrants from England who served this family. This is information we can find in a census. And it saddens me that the only story I have found is because one of these people was a victim of a terribly senseless murder that became tabloid material. So in the 1900 census, we find Idenlea's gardener, 60-year-old immigrant Richard Carthy. And 2 years later, he shows up in the newspapers. So to summarize, he was named Richard McGee. He used to walk Ellen Murphy home to her home on Rock Hill Road from her job at Idenlea. She did the washing in the household. Her husband was said to have become jealous of the older man's attention to his wife. One day, Mr. McGee was visiting friends in Manayunk, and on a walk home, he stopped by the Murphy house. After a fight erupted between the Murphys and another couple that was visiting, and Mr. McGee intervened to stop it, which angered the husband of the couple. And after a while, he left the house and his body was found in the woods. Both couples involved in the fight were arrested, and I have not found a resolution to this case or where he might be buried. So I can't tell you about other servants from this family, but I would like to, because I feel like their stories are just as fascinating in terms of the challenges they faced in their lives, but their stories are so much harder to research and to tell. So in the later years of Idenlea, Lucretia Blankenberg became more centrally involved in the property. So this is a 1913 newspaper article about an address she gave in Bala Cynwyd on suffrage. And I'm trying to figure out where that event might have occurred, what public space was used. Because at this time, she was well known for her activism, and she was the first lady. So this must have been a big deal. A few years after this, Dr. Myers sold her half of the property to her niece for $5. Here is the deed for that transfer. In 1918, when the country was still fighting World War I, Lucretia lost her beloved aunt to a stroke, someone she had lived with from childhood into adulthood. And then 2 weeks later, she lost her husband to a long illness. They were both buried in the family plot in Fair Hill Burial Ground in Philadelphia. So these are excerpts from the newspaper on the passing of Dr. Myers and Rudolph Blankenburg. And Lucretia explains in her autobiography, she had the home at Idenlea renovated, and then she moved in. The next few years were quiet for her as she was mourning these losses. And then in 1920, when she was 75 years old, she did a summer road trip across the country, which is amazing at that time. And she claimed it was tame, which I find it interesting because this was a time of tremendous turmoil in this country. This was only a year after the Red Summer, a time of violence and race massacres occurring across the country. What else happened in 1920? Passage of the 19th Amendment, meaning she could finally vote. So the culmination of decades of family activism. When it became clear that Bala Cynwyd was too quiet for her, in the spring of 1921, she sold Idenlea to be developed by John H. McClatchy. She moved back to the city and she lived in the hotel, the Bellevue Stratford, to be more in the center of things. 1921 was a big year. What else happened? Right around the time that she sold Idenlea, she founded 2 medical scholarships at Bryn Mawr College for women who are committed to medical careers in honor of her mother and her aunt. So the Hannah E. Longshore Memorial Medical Scholarship, the Jane V. Myers Memorial Medical Scholarship. And guess what? I pulled this information from the current undergraduate catalog because these scholarships are still to this day supporting women. Wow. And if you follow that small fortune I mentioned to the present day, here is a glimpse into the legacy of the women and this family, 170 years after the first women physicians received their degrees. There's a legacy of women shaping our lives today, successful healers like this, carrying on the purpose of those who came before them. And so I have traced the names of women who have received these scholarships, and I'm up to at least 30 from only a few decades. So I find it really powerful to think about the legacy of the work that was done by these women and how it's impacting our lives today. Let's go back to 1921 one more time, because right after she sold Idenlea, Lucretia Blankenberg made a decision that has created the biggest mystery I have stumbled across in this project. So, say you wanted to visit the final resting places of this remarkable family. I certainly did after discovering all this fascinating information about them. You would probably think to go to the Fair Hill Burial Ground in North Philadelphia, because that's where they were all buried over the decades. But if you go there, you will find empty spaces where their headstones should be. I took this photograph this winter in the locations where they're buried. This is a Quaker burial ground, so all the headstones are the same size. Why are these headstones missing? Because in 1921, Lucretia Blankenberg had her entire family disinterred from this burial ground, the same cemetery that's the final resting place of her friend Longshore's close friend, Lucretia Mott, and other luminaries of social activism in Philadelphia. What do I mean by this? I mean that almost 101 years ago, Lucretia had the following 11 members of her family disinterred from Fair Hill to be cremated at Chelton Hills Crematory. So these are her grandparents, her children and her brother-in-law, her parents, her aunts, and her husband, the mayor of Philadelphia. How do I know this? From looking at old records from the Fair Hill burial ground. So here's an example of what this looks like. Here are the records for Mayor Blankenburg and his beloved daughter, Julia, who I showed you earlier in this photograph. So their death certificates confirm they were buried at this Fair Hill burial ground. And these are the burial records that show they were removed. In fact, the records say that Rudolph's ashes were buried in the same grave as his beloved daughter, Julia, in this cemetery. And I remember very clearly the day I pulled up these records on Ancestry.com, and I realized that family member after family member had been disinterred on the same day as I scanned through these records. But it gets even weirder because you might think the cremains were buried at Chelton Hills. That's what I thought. And so I went to Chelton Hills Cemetery in Germantown to look around and ask in the office where I might find the headstones. And they went into the back room where they keep their files, and they came out empty-handed. And so I worked over a month to try to get them to do archival research in their files. And I got a partial answer. And here is this answer on pink note cards from their records. They were able to find records on 7 of the 12 people, so including Lucretia. So the record at the top is for Lucretia Blankenberg and her mother, Hannah Longshore, on the bottom. They show they were not buried at the cemetery, but cremated, and their cremains were picked up by an undertaker named Elwood Heacock, who turns out to be a Quaker and the first president of the Philadelphia NAACP. Lucretia Blankenberg passed away in 1937, so I'm fairly certain that no one has touched the top card in like 85 years and the bottom one in 100, because if you look at the public information on these women and the family, it says they're all interred at Fair Hill Burial Ground or at Chelton Hills. So this is quite a mystery, and I hope it's solvable, and I have a few leads. I will keep you posted. But I cannot figure out why someone would do this to their family. In some cases, these people were interred for over 50 years at an established burial ground for the Society of Friends. I would love to find an answer to this mystery. I'm not sure if we ever will, but I am working on some documents at Swarthmore that give some context for a difficult relationship between the Society of Friends and this family. But Lucretia Blankenberg had her funeral at a friend's meeting house and was a member of the Society of Friends throughout her entire life. As you know by now, I love to make tables. And so I looked into the 31 men who have been mayor of Philadelphia since just before the Civil War. 6 are alive, and for all the others, I was able to locate their final resting place. For many, that's in West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bala Cynwyd. but not in the yellow. So if you wanted to visit the final resting place of the great reform mayor of Philadelphia, who took on the entrenched political machine of his day and worked for suffrage alongside his wife, that is not possible because that information is not publicly known right now. And I'm working on it, but it's certainly something that has piqued my interest and is one of many questions I have about this remarkable family. This is part of the reason why I'm nominating these women for a Pennsylvania historical marker, because there is still a place where this family gathered and did significant work, a place where their story can be shared in a way that will stand the test of time. So let's circle back to what was happening at Idenlea after this momentous year. So for 7 straight months, McClatchy ran a variation of this ad every few days, and my house, along with those of my neighbors, was built. For the next 30 years or so, the neighborhood was advertised in newspapers as Idenlea and the Idenlea Apartments. What is left of Idenlea if you take a look now? So if you're standing on Bala Avenue, right before you get into kind of the downtown area, and you look up, you will see the house on the top of the hill hiding behind all these buildings. Here I'm showing the iconic street signs of Lower Marion within Idenlea. It turns out they were developed by the Marion Civic Association, which was led by a good friend of Lucille Blankenberg by the name of Edward Bach. But 140 years ago, none of this was here except for that house at the top of the hill. What are some other traces of Idenlea? So this is an object behind the house. Does anyone want to take a guess at what it could be? I have a theory. Fence post, good guess. So it's about waist height, and you can see from the ball right below it, something broke off here a long time ago. And if you look at the atlas, this is right where Idenlea's stables and barns met that looped driveway. Of course, before the advent of cars, or otherwise known as horseless carriages, horses were an integral part of everyone's lives. I've already mentioned how Hannah Longshore drove her own horses, and it turns out her sister did too. They each had 2 carriages in operation for their outdoor practice. So you might be able to imagine them using this hitching post, which is so cool and is still there. I want to share another trace of the estate of Idenlea that I have found. This is a stone wall. It separates an alley in my backyard and 6 other houses on Kinwood Road from the adjacent properties in the backyards of Chestnut Avenue. I wonder if something in this middle picture might be catching your eye. So the weekend after Thanksgiving was really warm, and my daughters and I pulled the vegetation away from this wall. And I wonder if anyone notices something interesting about it. There you go. Joanne Fisher is my neighbor and has Idenlea's hitching post in her backyard. So this wall, it's actually 2 walls. One is a much older one. So perhaps the southern retaining wall for Idenlea. It's stacked stone and has no mortar. And then when our neighborhood was developed, there was a concrete slab put on the top of this older wall and a new one built on top with mortar. So another piece of evidence about the history of this estate hiding in plain sight. Before we wrap up, I want to end with one of the most compelling stories that I've come across in my research. This is an oral history that was shared with me by a neighbor. So this house used to be across the street from Idenlea at 9 North Highland Ave. And about 30 years ago, there was an elderly man on the porch who called my neighbor across the street and wanted to tell him about the history of the house. And the story he confirmed all of my findings to the point that I got goosebumps when I heard it. So this older man said he had grown up across the street from the stone house and that it was owned by a wealthy woman, a doctor, which was unusual at that time because there were no lady doctors. And she used to drive her horses around doing house calls and treating sick people. He said the property had the same frontage on North Highland, but once extended all the way to the railroad. And he said after the lady doctor, it was the home of the mayor of Philadelphia. And then the home of the governor of Pennsylvania, named Brumbaugh. This man said that he grew up along with the son of the governor and that there were horses on the property along with barns. And there were 2 ponds stocked with fish at the bottom of the hill, one with ornamental goldfish and one stocked with game fish that the governor liked to fish for sport, which is a particularly vivid detail I will ask you to tuck away for later. And this man also said he was an inventor who made airplane parts during World War II for the US government, and that he had invented a flow-through tea bag, which is another vivid detail I will ask you to tuck away for later. So this neighbor heard this story on the porch, said goodbye to the neighbor and thought, wow, that's something. And so he tucked that memory away to share with others, including me, almost 30 years later. And I heard this oral history and I thought, I need to trace all the elements of this jaw-dropping story. And so I did, and I'm still working on some of it. It took me a while to figure out the owner of that house across the street and research him. And with the help of some of you on this call, I was able to get in touch with the family, who generously gave me their time and stories and photographs for this project. And so here's what I have found so far. This family generously shared with me a photograph of the same house, taken from a similar angle in 1910. The house was demolished to make way for a new apartment building, and it's currently a fenced off empty lot in the downtown Bala Ave. The name of this man was Radley Cross, but he went by the name of Bill. He was born in this house in 1911. He had a younger and an older sister. He graduated from Lower Marion High School in 1928. He was an incredibly fascinating man, and I want to do a project just on this family. So here's one tidbit. The girl in this photograph sitting on the steps is Bill's older sister, Dorothy. She grew up to be Dorothy Cross Jensen, a renowned archaeologist, anthropologist, and public educator with her own Wikipedia page describing her work in Middle Eastern archaeology and closer to home in anthropology and prehistory of New Jersey. She was a professor at Hunter College and did lots of other inspirational work. So Bill Cross lived in this house with his wife and 3 sons until his death in 1996. Now remember, I told you this man claimed he was an inventor. Well, he was. So was his father, who built that house in 1910. They were a brilliant pair of father-son inventors. Here I'm showing some of their many patents that I found. So one is an automatic controlling mechanism for a brick machine, and the other is a cotton gin. And do you want to guess what else they patented? Something that makes that oral history really come alive. And I saw somebody mention it. I think it was Carol. They patented a flow-through tea bag. It turns out in 1939, the Cross family patented this tea bag, and here's a part of the patent. It was commissioned by the Mutual Tea Packing Company of New York. It used cotton fabric, and it was designed to be efficiently made by hand or machine. And so finding this patent blew my mind, because after more research, I came to realize that every other aspect of the oral history that this man told my neighbor had checked out, including the detail about not only 1, but 2 ponds on the property, because there were 2 ponds. If you look at those atlases, they were on either side of what's now Bella Avenue. So does this mean the Governor Brumbaugh of Pennsylvania used to hang out at Idenlea? There is a lot of circumstantial evidence that the answer to that question is yes. Because the governor in this time frame of interest was Martin Grove Brumbaugh. Mayor Blankenburg and Governor Brumbaugh were close allies, both committed reformers, both of German ancestry. They served on boards together. Brumbaugh was superintendent of the schools under Blankenburg. And after Blankenburg finished his term in office, they lived 1 block away from each other in Germantown. And here's the detail that brought it home for me. I learned in Martin Grove Brumbaugh's biography that he was an avid fisher, as in obsessed with fishing at every opportunity. Just the kind of man who might have asked his friends, the Blankenbergs, to stock the pond at Idenlea for a getaway from the city for some fishing. And so I'm grateful to my collaborators at Juniata College, an institution that was a constant in Dr. Brumbaugh's life because he was more of an educator than a politician. And they found this image for me with him with a fish in hand, and they're searching through their collections right now to see if we can find any corroborating evidence for Bill Cross's story. And so I tell you this not just because it's a good story, which it is, but because it shows the power of oral history being passed down and shared through generations. And so when I walk over the sidewalk where this pond used to be, I imagine what it used to look like. And, was Governor Brumbaugh there stealing away from the city to, fish at the stocked pond? There's another compelling tidbit that relates to this oral history I want to share. So since I started this project, other women physicians have been popping up everywhere I look. Here are 6 of them. Dr. Harriet Sartain was a noted and very successful physician in Philadelphia, close friend of the family, lived next door to the Blankenbergs in West Logan Square. Her husband worked under the mayor, Rudolph Blankenberg. Her son, Dr. Paul Sartain, signed Dr. Longshore's death certificate and funded a scholarship in her name at Bryn Mawr, which I think is not a coincidence. Dr. Mary Davis Ridgway was a physician who signed Rudolph Blankenberg's death certificate. She has her own Pennsylvania historical marker in Germantown. Dr. Hannah Howard Shaw was a leader of the suffrage movement in the United States, worked closely with Lucretia Blankenberg. In terms of graduates from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, where the women physicians of Idenlea studied, I've come across Dr. Frances Sprague and Dr. Mary Wilcox, who both practiced in Lower Marion. They signed the death certificates of Dr. Myers and her sister Julia, who lived with her at Idenlea until 1905. And Dr. Catherine Radley, class of 1902, had a medical practice in West Philadelphia. How does Dr. Radley tie into this oral history? Well, the Cross family shared with me that Radley Cross, known as Bill, had been named after the women physician who delivered him. And so I looked for a woman physician by that name during this time frame. And it turns out she delivered all 3 Cross children born across the street from Idenlea. And here are excerpts of their birth certificates. And this 3rd arrow brings home that the inventor Radley Cross, who shared this amazing oral history of Idenlea, was named after the woman physician who delivered him in his family's house on Highland Avenue across the street from Idenlea in 1911. Wow. So quickly, if there's anyone who's interested in joining me to work on this community project, I have many genealogical leads I'm trying to trace, materials and archives waiting to be reviewed. I think the story is important, and I want to know other ideas about directions that it could go. I want to do some acknowledgements for friends and neighbors. My friend Jim Bevlock, Ted Goldsboro, my neighbor Joanne Fisher on the call, all of my neighbors in Kinwood Road, the Cross family who shared all the archives with me, experts who have been so generous with their time, my colleagues at the museum, my children and my husband who have put up with me these past few months, and I've covered their faces for privacy reasons, but this photograph gets across, the time when we excavated this southern retaining wall. And they've been so supportive throughout the entire process. I'll end with the documents that started this all. So what an adventure it has been since I laid eyes on these atlases. Here is my email if you'd like to get in touch with me. It would be great to have some time. I don't know how many of you stuck with me for this presentation, but if there are questions or comments, we'll have time for that discussion now. And I saw someone say, are you prepared to have all of us coming to your house tomorrow? Yes, please come to Idenlea. There's a house, there are traces of these amazing women here. And I hope someday a Pennsylvania historical marker that captures the significance of the work that they did. So I welcome all of you to visit and also to participate in this project as it goes on.
Erin, this has been, I'm absolutely stunned by the amount of information that you have gathered in, did you say 6 months?
Yes. It's almost exactly 6 months when I kind of discovered where I was living and looked at those first names. So yeah, it has been a journey, quite a journey since then. I've been pulled because this story is so powerful. And I have people on the way who've been helping me. So it's wonderful to see it coming together right now.
Unbelievable. And my very first job in Philadelphia was at the Bellevue Stratford. It was at that point called the Bellevue, but I've always been fascinated by the history of that building. And so to see, in this book, I want to share with you guys, thanks to Erin and Ted Goldsboro. I don't know if you can see it because of the glare, but we have a copy of the Blankenburgs of Philadelphia. And Erin found this book at a rare book dealer. Is that it?
Yeah.
So this is actually a 1928 copy of it. And if you look closely, if I can hold it up, you can actually see Lucretia's signature in this book. So she and Ted were just so gracious enough to donate this gift to our library. This copy we have in reference. We don't necessarily want to circulate this right now because we're just kind of concerned since it's, one of the originals in the, it's in beautiful condition, but it's slightly fragile. But our head librarian, Jean, was also able to find a more recent edition of it. It was republished. So we do have a copy of that in circulation. So hopefully you guys get a chance to check it out. That you can check out literally. This one, please stop by and flip through it if you get the chance, because as Erin was saying, she and I had a brief conversation today about just the progressive thinking of this family at that age, at that period of history is mind-blowing. And it's Lucretia starts off in here saying about her mother, she was ostracized as a child because her mother was a female physician, and obviously, the first in Philadelphia. And she said that really kind of set her on the road to fighting for women's rights. And I just want to point out that the very last page of this book, this is her autobiography. It does say that at the publication of this book, she was actually in, I believe, Honolulu, 1928, fighting, I can't find the page that quickly, fighting for the rights of her brown sisters in the Pan-Pacific. So, yeah, where she's trying to help solve the problems of her brown sisters of the Pacific Basin. She never stopped. She kept going, and it's incredible.
The scope of the work done by this family over decades, there's a reason why I feel the historic recognition is so long overdue. Like the mark that they left on this city, it's interesting to think about why it hasn't been remembered in certain ways, but it's very much warrants kind of us learning about the work that they did, the causes that they supported, how it shaped our lives. And like you said, Lucretia Blankenberg traveled all over the place and knew everyone, and they knew she was an ally for, the kind of progressive causes that are important and shaped our lives today. So yeah, that book is a wonderful insight into kind of the thought process and the scope of what they did. Yeah.
We don't want to take up too much of your time, but we do have a few questions here. Where is Fair Hill Cemetery?
So it's in kind of North Philadelphia, and it certainly, the city was kind of built up around it. So it was one of the oldest Quaker burial grounds. And going back to the 1700s, the most burials were around the kind of early 1800s, mid-century there. And so there are a lot of really notable Quaker figures who are buried there. And the neighborhood has changed over time, but the Fair Hill Burial Ground has a lot of educational programming and working with the community to kind of build networks that I think is also a really interesting part of the story. Yeah.
We also have a comment from Faye here. I went to MCP, the Women's Medical College, and grew up in Wyncote on Heacock Lane. Not sure if same family.
Yes.
Do you know anything?
So Elwood Heacock is what I'm looking into now. He was the undertaker for this family for decades, and I think was a very prominent undertaker. And as I said, was the first president of the Philadelphia NAACP. So I think it's not an accident that he was the undertaker for this family. And I'm trying to trace the records of his funeral practice because it is an open question about what happened to those cremains when he picked them up. And so I've spoken with Quaker scholars and others to try to figure out what happened to these remains. I'm sure there's an answer somewhere and I hope we can get it. But one key kind of genealogical question I'm working on is the Heacock family and what happened with that undertaker practice.
And tons of kudos here for your research and what an amazing job you've done. Thank you for your scholarship and passion. We can't wait to learn more. Lots of that going on. People are now going to look at things a little more closely now that you're pointing things out. Thank you. This was very interesting since my daughter just graduated from medical school last Friday. I think you should know that this point in history where there are more women graduating every year in medicine than men. It's fascinating. I believe somebody did ask what the reason specifically is for this project.
That's a great question. It very much just relates to my interest in kind of the history of where I live, and then uncovering all this kind of significant history and being pulled into kind of beyond where I live, into Philadelphia history, into Pennsylvania history, into national history. And it's alongside that has become kind of a community project. So several of my neighbors, experts at all of the different kind of collaborating institutions, have been contributing different pieces of this. And so, I'm excited to see where it goes, and I think, it's kind of exciting to be part of something that was not known, like this is very much forgotten history that people used to know about. But, it's of significance for all of us. So, I think part of the reason was just pure luck of somehow living on this historically significant place. But, everywhere we live has some history. And there are, you can approach it different ways to try to find out more information about what shaped the place where you live. And so I hope that this can be kind of an inspiration to people to start asking those questions and, just trying to get some answers about it, and see where it can lead you and your community.
Eric wants to know if you are you aware of any relationship between Bill Cross and the Cross Properties company that demolished the house on Highland?
It is a very interesting coincidence, but there is no relationship that I have been able to tell. So, the Cross family moved out of the house shortly after the death of Bill Cross, and they live in Lower Marion nearby, but they're not in Bala Cynwyd. And then, several years later, Cross Properties kind of purchased the property and has undertaken this kind of large development program within Bala Cynwyd. But that's an interesting coincidence. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out if that was the case, but it seems like it is an actual coincidence.
What is the most important legacy that Lucretia Longshore leaves us? What do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think the biggest thing is figuring out what you think your role can be and building coalitions to achieve your goal, I guess. And so, you know, what we saw from kind of the volume of people that celebrated her long life, from the commemorative volume that has like 100 pages of all these people that she worked with closely. And so she built these networks, and look at what happened, look at what the outcomes were of them. And so my lesson I'm taking away is the power of kind of networking and community building to achieve change at scale, I would say. And the other lesson I would say is kind of sharing your story. So her book is such an important source of information for me to understand choices that she made and kind of the impact of the work that she did, because she told her story kind of in her own words. And so, you know, passing that forward, making a record of kind of the work that you did in your life, that's also something that rings true for me.
I think you probably answered this next question in that, what do you like most about the story?
I mean, partly I think the work that all these women did individually is very inspiring and significant, but together, what a story, you know, like the combination of this family supporting each other during a time of hardship, reinforcing each other's kind of passions, and that legacy being carried through for today. So, you know, the most interesting thing for me is what they were able to achieve together, and how close their bonds were. You will see in the book about how they were just knitted together from the very beginning, and working together in their various ways to kind of make these things possible.
Jamie has a good point here, and hopefully Jamie, maybe you can touch base with Erin on this. She says, Erin, the presentation given by Lucretia Blankenberg, the newspaper said it was in Kinwood. You wondered where the presentation could have been. Could it have been at Levering Mill Tribute House? It was originally the headquarters for the Women's Club.
Yeah, so I have reached out to the Women's Club historians, and we'll be touching base soon, because that is one of my many questions, because in the commemorative volume for Lucretia Blankenberg is an entire page from the Women's Club of Bala Cynwyd with a message and signatories from all of the leaders in 1925. So there was a close relationship there, clearly. Another location I'm interested in looking at is right along Bala Avenue. It's the building that was not demolished to make way for the development. That building on the corner was a public auditorium in the early 20th century. And I found this information in newspapers and other sources, especially during World War I. There were rallies there. There were plays, there were publications. So that location in Bala Cynwyd possibly could have held a group of this size to do an address on suffrage. But I haven't been able to piece together if that's actually true. So that's another active area of research that I'm trying to do, because I think it's important to think about the links between Lucretia Blankenberg and the Women's Club of Bala Cynwyd and all these other women's groups as they were turning towards activism for suffrage. So one of Lucretia Blankenberg's contributions is linking across all these women's clubs and to get them oriented towards suffrage. And so that took many, many years, and she was key in doing that at the state level and at the city level.
And I think we could just wrap up with this one. I wish I could get to all of these comments. Tons and tons of kudos to you for all this amazing research, and you're a great storyteller, it says in here. But just this last thought, what do you think was the strength of the family to fight for women's rights in those times, which we know was very difficult?
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about the people who had the vision before the country was ready to kind of move in those directions. And so what was it about them? I think part of it was because they were Quakers, and Quakers had a tradition of women speaking in meetings and women having a voice in the community. And so you see a lot of activists like Lucretia Mott coming out of the Society of Friends. And so I think there were at least 5 women in that first graduating class from the female medical college that were Quakers. And so I think part of it was the worldview that they had that wasn't constrained by some of the social norms of the time. And then the family being willing to take risks and work together. So, Samuel Myers educating his daughters and making a way for them to study medicine. And the uncle who founded the school, and it took the men in this situation to create that space for the women to have that opportunity. Once they had that opportunity, there you go. That's kind of what you see today in their legacy. So, I think part of it is the driving force of this family and how they persisted over time and found success. So, things weren't easy, but they kept at it. They kept going. And, I think in terms of their contribution, you see the results of all of those decades of success across generations.
Well, I wish we could go on all night. Unfortunately, we can't. But this has just been absolutely incredible. You guys have Erin's information. If you have anything to add to this, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her. If you didn't get a chance to jot that down, by all means, you can get a hold of us at the library and we'll get the contact information. I look forward to hearing, good luck with all of this. I look forward to hearing back from you in the fall when we start our programs back up. Maybe we can get an update from you on how everything went and how everything goes from here on out.
I would love that. I mean, my hope is kind of to surface some community history that might help and people who are interested in answering some of the questions that I have. And so my hope is to kind of build this collectively as a collective action. So